Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the bird opening. In the bird opening, white chooses to play this move f4 here on move 1, grabbing some space in the center. This has never been as popular as more normal opening moves like e4 or d4, but it certainly has its adherents. It's going to grab some space on the king side for white. White can often get a big bind on the central dark squares, for example with the bishop along this diagonal, the knight on f3 helping to control the e5 and d4 squares, and it also ensures that white can develop this knight to f3 without blocking in that pawn. In many openings, this knight comes to f3 blocking in this pawn on f2, but here white wants this pawn involved in the fight for central space. The real downside, though, to the bird opening is that this move immediately exposes the short side diagonal here to the king, which is often very dangerous in the opening, and we're going to see some ways that black can try to exploit this in some lines. Okay, let's take a look at how this opening can go. One of black's most popular moves here is to play d5, which makes a lot of sense. Black's just grabbing some space themselves and putting a pawn there in the center. White can play knight to f3, knight f6, and now b3 is a popular move. This bishop doesn't have as many prospects along this diagonal because that f-pawn's in the way, so it's often going to come here to b2, where it works well with this knight and pawn to control some squares here in the center. Black has several options here, which is often the case in the opening when there's no immediate threats and pawn tension. Both sides kind of have the freedom to develop how they like. Black will often adopt a fianchetto setup here on the king side. This bishop can be a good defender of the king after the king castles, especially because black knows that white might be trying to launch an attack later on the king side because white already has space on this side of the board. So g6, bishop b2, bishop g7. White can play e3 here and open a path for the other bishop. Black can castle. White often just plays bishop e2 here. There's not really a better square for that bishop, unless white wants to adopt this double fianchetto setup where they play g3 and bishop g2. Going to b5 doesn't make much sense because there's no real targets on this diagonal, and black can just kick that bishop away. So bishop e2 is the most popular move here. Black will often grab some more space with c5, castle, knight c6. All very normal developing moves. We see that black has a good share of space here in the center. Black's getting some pieces developed. And here white will often play knight to e5, supported here by the pawn and the bishop. And if black were to exchange here on e5, then this f-pawn could take and kick this knight away. So black usually won't do that yet. They might play queen to c7. And white might have some ideas here to play something like queen e1 and queen h4 at some point, building up on the king side. White might even be able to play g4 at some point, intending to play f5 or g5 and really get their attack going on the king side. Of course, that can be very risky, opening up your own king, but there's some lines where white can try to do this. If this knight here gets exchanged off, this other knight might be headed for f3 as well. Maybe it could hop into to e5 at some point. But meanwhile, from black's perspective, black's going to be able to finish their development. Black's king is safe for now, tucked away behind this bishop in this very compact position. And black is fine here too. The position would be considered roughly equal. Both players have a few alternative setups. I mentioned that sometimes white will fianchetto this bishop, maybe even going for a double fianchetto setup where both bishops get fianchettoed. Sometimes this white bishop will come to b5 after the knight comes to c6, simply because this bishop is kind of passive here on e2, so white might just want to trade that bishop off for the knight. That does give black the pair of bishops, but white might prefer that to letting this bishop be here on e2. And one alternative setup here for white is to go for the stonewall pawn structure, for example after e3 and d4, getting this very rigid fixed structure here in the middle. This is a well-known attacking setup from a few different openings. White might later play this knight into e5, and it's going to be hard for black to get rid of that knight without letting a pawn come to e5 and kicking the knight away. Really, one of the main downsides for white of choosing this structure is that this dark squared bishop becomes very bad. All of its paths here kind of get blocked off, but sometimes white tries to fix this later on with a maneuver like bishop d2, bishop e1, and bishop h4, swinging that bishop into the action, but of course that takes quite a while to organize. The other big downside is that white has committed to making this hole in their pawn structure here on e4, where no pawn can ever control that square again, and black can sometimes try to exploit this by getting a knight into e4, possibly reinforcing it with some other of their minor pieces, and that can be a thorn in white's side. But it's good to know that this stonewall option exists here for white, this stonewall pawn structure with f4, e3, and d4, really clamping down on the e5 square. So far we've examined what happens after d5. Black certainly does not have to play this move d5. We can consider some other moves here. For example, knight to f6 is reasonable, simply taking the e4 square under control. And after white plays knight to f3, black could still play d5, but let's say they play g6. White can play here g3 or b3. Those are white's two most popular moves. Let's say white plays b3 like we looked at in the last example. Bishop g7, bishop b2. Black can go ahead and castle. And if white plays e3 here, black could play d5, and that would actually transpose to a position we looked at from our first example, but black might adopt an alternative setup here by playing something like d6, possibly hoping to support an e5 break at some point in the center, maybe after knight b to d7, possibly after rook e8, and black might want to strike at the center here with e5, which is a square that white usually has under very good control. So that's one alternative setup for black. But of course, if you don't put this pawn on d5, white might eventually be able to play e4, which is pretty hard for them to arrange if you do have that pawn on d5. For example, if white were to play d3 in the coming moves, black would have to consider whether they want to allow white to play this move e4 and grab more space. There are certainly other moves as well. For example, c5 is one option. This gives white the choice to enter a Sicilian defense if white plays e4 here, or white could just keep the game to bird opening lines with moves like knight f3 and b3 like we've seen. And black's probably going to have to either play some variation with d5 or with d6. It's kind of hard for black to avoid transposing to one of those lines we already looked at. Black also has this option to play here on move 1 f5. This is very rarely chosen, but it leads to a much more symmetrical game. But I think black's most interesting, unique option here is to try to exploit the fact that white has opened this king's diagonal and play this very interesting pawn sacrifice e5. This is called the Fromm gambit. And at first glance, it doesn't make much sense. It looks like black is just giving up one of their valuable central pawns. But let's see what happens if white accepts this gambit. If white plays f takes e5, black's idea is to play d6, threatening to win the pawn back here. And if white trades off those pawns, black gets to play bishop to d6. And here's the situation we're in now. White is definitely up a pawn. Black actually has no central pawns remaining. But the threats to this diagonal here to the king become pretty severe. Black already has a threat if white's not careful. Let's say white plays a move like knight to c3, then black would be able to checkmate white with queen to h4 check. And now because of the help of this bishop, g3 is not sufficient to cut off this diagonal. White could play queen takes g3. Of course, bishop takes g3 works too, but this is more fun. hg3 and bishop takes g3 checkmate. So white should definitely not allow that. So after that bishop takes on d6, white will usually play knight to f3. Taking this h4 square under control. But now black gets to have some fun. Black's most popular move here is g5, simply threatening to kick this knight away and then play queen h4. And it's not so easy for white to deal with this. I remember playing this line with black in a blitz game against an 1800 player many years ago, and he responded by playing h3, trying to stop this pawn from advancing, but of course now bishop g3 is checkmate. So we had a laugh about that. So what should white do instead? White should probably play g3 here to further take this h4 square under control, but black still has some ideas here. Black can play g4, kick the knight anyway, and after knight h4, black will often continue with knight to e7 here, where this knight's coming to g6, trying to get rid of this knight here on h4, and in the main line d4, knight to g6. This knight is forced to exchange off, and now black gets to open the h-file for their rook. Black's once again threatening to play bishop takes g3 now, because of this pin on the h-file. White only has one move here they can really play to really stay alive. Go ahead and pause your video if you want to think about what white can play here. Okay, if you're back with me. So they can't move this rook to break the pin. If they played rook g1, then rook takes h2 is very strong. White should play queen to d3 here, just taking this g3 square under further control. Some of you might have said bishop g2, helping to break the pin by defending this rook, but go ahead and pause your video if you want to think about what black can play now. Okay, black actually has a tactic here too. Rook takes h2 would work now, because after black recaptures this rook, black is going to get that rook back and pick up two pawns in the meantime. So that's not good for white either. Another example of the dangerous tactics white can face because this diagonal to the king was opened. So white has to really know their stuff here in the Fromm's gambit if they want to survive. Black has a lot of possible threats along this diagonal, so this is a very aggressive option to take on the bird opening with black. Now, going back here to move 1 after f4 e5, of course white does not have to accept your pawn sacrifice. White can certainly play the move e4 here and go into the king's gambit. quite a few players will do this who play the bird opening to avoid the Fromm gambit. So if you want to play the Fromm gambit against the bird, make sure you're comfortable playing the black side of a king's gambit as well, because white might choose to enter the king's gambit with e4. Thank you very much for watching, and please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up there. It only takes a couple seconds, totally free, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. Thanks, and I'll see you there.